Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin O'Connor. I'm a director here at New London Architecture, and welcome to this NLA PechaKucha this afternoon. I just have to apologise first of all. There appear to be some construction works going on just behind me. If there's any noise, we'll try and get through it. For those of you who don't know, NLA is London's leading independent centre for the built environment. We bring together professionals, politicians, and the public to learn about, debate, and ultimately have a voice on the future shape of London. This afternoon's event is part of our new digital programme that's been running for the last 3 months since lockdown began, and it's the first in our Build Back Better series. The event also marks the end of our annual Active Travel Summit, which has been taking place all day. Build Back Better is a new initiative by NLA to respond to the current crisis. The series will look into the future beyond the restrictions of our present situation, and we're inviting innovative thinkers to present thought-provoking ideas and solutions for a resilient post-pandemic London. Today, we're going to hear a selection of these ideas dedicated to active travel, so some ideas for the future of our streets. There will be time for a Q&A at the end, so please do post your questions throughout the event using the Zoom Q&A button just at the bottom of your screen. Each speaker today will present in the PechaKucha format, speaking with just 20 slides, each slide on screen for just 20 seconds, and we have 6 speakers overall. I'm going to hand over to our first speaker now, just as the construction works carry on behind me. Our first speaker is Kuros Sarshar, who's Project Director at John Robertson Architects, and he'll be presenting on their idea around London bike lines. Over to you, Kuros.
Thanks, Benjamin. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like you to imagine for a moment that London has a network of green arteries that stretch out in all directions towards the periphery, serving a diverse cross-section of London's workforce who've made the choice to commute by active means, keeping them fitter, healthier, and happier, and also lowering the carbon footprint of their city. Well, in some cities in the world, you don't have to imagine this because it's already a reality. And in Copenhagen and Amsterdam, for example, between 35 and 50% of all journeys within the city are made by bicycle. And in London, that figure, unfortunately, is around only 3%. And for those who actively travel, particularly cycling, remains a privilege of the athletic and the brave, and some would say foolish. Active travel isn't a new concept in the UK. Indeed, before the explosion of car ownership in the 60s, Britons were accustomed to getting around by bike and on foot. And this graph shows how car ownership has driven out cyclists from the road network. Indeed, when compared with other forms of transport, cycling is by far the most efficient we've created. And it's particularly effective over shorter distances. Now, with lockdown and social distancing regulations having a considerable impact on the use of our transport network, perhaps now's the time to build back resilience and create conditions to encourage more efficient means of travel. And whilst cars, taxis, and buses might be comfortable, they're not the most effective form of mass transit available to us. And indeed, mixing the two has been shown to reduce the efficiency of considerably of both of them and to bring them into conflict. It's the Mayor of London's ambition that London becomes a carbon zero city by 2030. And to get there, we'll need to decarbonise major parts of our transport network and dramatically reduce our reliance on fossil-fuelled private vehicles. So how do we get there? Well, we've already made some improvements, but now's the time to really think big and invest big in an active travel infrastructure and to encourage more people to change their commuting habits. So how do we encourage modal change? We already offer rental bikes, electric bikes, cycle superhighways, quiet ways, priority traffic lights, and we've even got our own cycling czar. We can tell people that they'll be healthier, happier, and better off, but is this enough? When we ask large numbers of people why they don't cycle into work consistently, the feedback we get from those living in London is that cycling in London is dangerous. Cycle lanes aren't safe, they're hard to navigate for the layperson. And on top of that, end of trip facilities such as showers and lockers aren't always there, and they worry about bike theft. So where do we go from here? The COVID pandemic has had a huge impact on the day-to-day lives of Londoners. Some of us have concluded that we can adapt to the new ways of working and will make fewer trips by car, by shopping locally more frequently. But we won't work from home forever. So how can we harness these positive new habits? We've already seen many of our high streets adapted with cones with the aim of supporting social distance guidelines for essential local shopping trips. When lockdown eases, however, we're likely to see more people returning to London's central activity zone, where over 1.7 million people work, generating 10% of the UK's GDP. The head of TfL suggests that we could see the London's transit system reduced by as much as 85% in the short term in terms of capacity, as it seeks to maintain social distancing across the network. Through Streetscape, the Mayor of London's pledging £250 million in grants to make local journeys safe. But we feel that London's still missing that London-wide solution. And this is where Bike Lines comes in. Bike Lines are conceived as dedicated, convenient and easy to navigate active travel routes into the heart of the city. They'll connect initially those within a half-hour commute by bike to the city centre. Installed as a temporary pop-up, the routes would be tested and refined over the coming months with a view to becoming more permanent. The concept originated from a couple of sketches developed by a team of 15 industry professionals, brought together by the shared passion for urban design and cycling. Over the past 12 weeks, they've contributed their spare time to design and debate and visualise the scheme, inviting key figures and policymakers to join the conversation. In that time, we've seen major cities around the world, Berlin, New York, Paris, Vancouver, Mexico City and Bogota, to name just a few, all beginning to convert roads into cycle lanes. In the UK, cities Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Glasgow and Liverpool are fast following in their footsteps. In London, cycling has seen consistently strong growth over the past 15 years, thanks to investment and realisation of various infrastructure schemes across London boroughs. There's evidence to suggest that we now need a step change in safety, legibility and continuity of the cycle infrastructure. London bike lines are entirely segregated for safety and organised along familiar colour-coded routes of the London Underground network to make them legible and easy to navigate. This network of routes is simple, safe and convenient to access from your local town centre and major commuter interchanges, serving Greater London and the home counties. We've opted for these travel lanes to take a central position on the carriageway, arranged in meandering configurations to allow buses, taxis and delivery vehicles to flow around one another and make contact safely with the curb without bringing them into conflict with bikes. And whilst initially implemented as a pop-up, the ambition of the scheme is to make a more permanent intervention into the city and for us to become less reliant on travel by motorised transport. So in conclusion, we strongly believe that now is a great time for London to explore big ideas like this. Bike lines could be up and running in a matter of weeks, supporting London's economic recovery and building the foundations of a carbon zero city. If you're interested to find out more, please find us on Twitter by searching for @BikeLinesLDN. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Kouros. For those of you who have just joined us in the past few minutes, welcome. I just want to let you know you can ask questions of any of our panelists throughout. Just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I will be able to ask those questions at the end of the event. So our next presentation is going to be coming from Benjamin Knowles, a rider for Pedal Me, and he'll be talking to us about the pedal-powered taxi service. Benjamin, over to you.
Hello, yes. My name is Ben Knowles. I'm a rider and chief exec of a company called Pedal Me. I'm also a former transport planner. So here's a picture of me in my former life. I'm a passionate believer in, first of all, the power of cycling to help people change their lives, access places that they couldn't access otherwise. And I'm a real believer that many people want to be able to cycle but are currently excluded from doing so. These pictures are from a project that I ran as a transport planner when I worked for Camden. The project still runs today. It's findable as @Camden Cycling on Twitter. I'm also a really big believer in the power of cargo bikes. And so one of the things that we did to help us run this particular project, which was helping people from council estates access cycling, was that we gave them cargo bikes, and we also used cargo bikes to transport the bikes around. And what we found in doing this was that it was way more effective than anything else we tried. So we tried using vans, we got parking tickets. It was a waste of everyone's time. Sometimes the journey took 20 minutes, sometimes it took an hour. And that meant we always had to pay someone for an hour to be sitting in traffic. So we found alternate methods of moving the bikes around. We then realized that there was actually a commercial application for this. And we started a company called PedalMe. And here we are moving a ridiculous number of Christmas presents around by bike, Christmas present donations. So our idea is that the main barrier to people using bikes and walking to get around is motor vehicles. A significant percentage of those motor vehicles in London are commercial vehicles. We can replace many of those trips. So we use these bikes to transport people and improbable sized loads around London. And because we can replace so many of these motor trips, we become a viable like-for-like replacement for many of those motor vehicles. And we can help city authorities to close more streets by providing alternate provision. And I say this is an idea, but this is something that's already operating in London. And if you're based in London, hopefully you will have seen our bikes floating around. This is us delivering for a charity called Little Village. During the pandemic, we stepped into action and helped to deliver its cots, its nappies and baby care items to families in need. We can also do hot food deliveries, but not really like Deliveroo style two dinners. But this is something like 200 dinners on their way to an office. Something else that's unique about us is that we have all employees, and everyone is trained to a very high standard in order to be able to ride our bikes. That discipline allows us to hygiene train people, and so we can be very careful about how we're doing deliveries. And this is a picture of a project in Lambeth where we were delivering food to shielded and sick individuals to allow them to stay at home. I don't believe that anyone else could have been able to do this job in anywhere near the way that we did it, for anywhere near the cost that we did it. So cyclogistics is not only it's not just that it's a viable option, but it's actually a cheaper option often too. The training. So we have our own City and Guilds accreditation. So it's externally assured to make sure that all of our riders ride to a uniform standard. And this is a rider being given training by Chris Dixon, who's our head of training. And so I'm really excited to hear about the planned changes to London, and indeed to see some of those changes going in. And I'm hopeful that we will be able to facilitate more dramatic changes over time by replacing motor vehicles for trips that currently require motor vehicles. And I just wanted to finish off by showing you some pictures of this was Car Free Day. So we provided the logistics for Car Free Day for London, transporting people and things around the site. It was something like 20 kilometres of closed streets. And it's such an amazing day, and so wonderful to see how people interact in an environment which removes the noise and the fear that's associated with large numbers of motor vehicles trying to move around at speed. And these next few slides are just hoping to give you an insight into how our cities could be looking in a world where there are many less motor vehicles needed, or at least those motor vehicles are excluded from our city centre streets during the working day. And the last slide is just my contact details. So if you want to get in touch about anything here, you can get in touch through the Q&A, or you can contact me directly. Thank you for listening.
Great, thank you very much, Ben. I know Peter Murray was very happy that you included his Cheapside drawing there. So I'm sure some of you have seen that floating around Twitter, that vision for a pedestrianised Cheapside. Thank you again, Ben. So our next speaker is Mike Saunders, who's CEO at Commonplace, and he'll be talking about conversations during the recovery. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. Hi, everybody. As Ben said, I'm CEO of Commonplace. And for those of you who don't know, Commonplace is an online community engagement platform for places. Our focus is on connecting people to the places that they live, play or work, in order to help them participate in a conversation that accelerates positive change. And we facilitate and interpret these open, trusted conversations. So when we went into lockdown, we didn't just want that mission statement to be something written on our About Us page. We wanted to live by it, and that's why we decided to offer our platform for free to local authorities trying to engage their communities to coordinate their emergency responses during the pandemic. At first, the response was quite slow from local authorities. They were obviously responding to the health emergencies and to this new life in lockdown. But as we started to move into recovery, and when Grant Shapps announced that he was bringing forward investment in active travel infrastructure, our work has really started to kick off. As you all know, much of the rhetoric about active travel is extremely positive. It's a policy that delivers better health, improved air quality, reduced congestion, more usable spaces, all in one go. But the problems in the past sometimes have been of funding, of getting beyond some small lobby groups, and that it's always not always being politically expedient. But in a way, COVID-19 has offered a solution, or at least has helped to prioritise. Streets have to be rethought in order to accommodate social distancing. Queuing outside shops requires wider pavements, and with fewer people wanting to use public transport, there's more need and potentially more space for walking and cycling. However, recent projections have shown that car numbers are actually due to go up well beyond previous levels as people try to self-isolate as they travel. TfL itself has predicted car use in central London could double if nothing is done. So what do local communities think about this? Well, the conversation is still happening, so it's too early to tell exactly. But one thing we can do is map the spread of conversations just on the Commonplace platform. To date, over 40 local authorities around the country has taken us up on this offer for a free licence for their emergency responses, including 8 London boroughs. And we've had over 200,000 contributions and engaged over 150,000 people. So what does a conversation look like, and how can it help? It's important, firstly, to acknowledge that there isn't any silver bullet when it comes to interventions to the streets for social distancing and active travel. There are local considerations of all sorts, and the measures must be relevant to the communities. That's one of the things they tell us strongly. But let's look at a few examples. In Lewisham, southeast London, over 2,300 people have responded with 1,500 individual comments and 10,000 agreements, that's agreeing with other people's comments. Over a third of these responses, 34% suggested closing a street to cars, and 27% suggested adding temporary cycle paths. In Islington, similar sentiments, but one of the key takeouts was that over 92% of the 2,400 people who participated supported short-term emergency measures being extended into permanent, longer-term changes. In Bath and North East Somerset, more suburban and rural area of the UK, people are focused on safety on and around streets. 45% of the respondents identified fast traffic as an issue and highlighted key spots where cyclists have been nearly hit on several occasions. This was reiterated in Stockport, another suburban area where a key point for residents was cyclist safety. However, the majority of residents here said that they felt safer in recent weeks due to there being less traffic, indicating that new normal is a welcome change. What can all this data achieve? Well, in Leeds, after gathering over 20,000 contributions via Commonplace, the City Council has laid out ambitious plans to build an additional 100 kilometres of cycle paths across the city to promote active travel. The plans also include low traffic neighbourhoods and temporarily widened footways based predominantly on this feedback. Interestingly, we saw a distinct change in responses throughout the lockdown. Initially, responses focused on immediate action for public safety, but there's now a growing support for communities to make these changes permanent and for this to become more like the new normal. Our research clearly highlights that community support for fundamentally reshaping our streets, but how do we actually get there? Well, I think technology has a really interesting role to play here, not as a solution, but if you like, as a tonic. It's part of the solution, and the three observations I'd like to share with you about how technology can help, particularly in this area of engagement. Embracing open, I think, is a game changer. By being completely open and honest in the way that engagement works, there's an opportunity to generate trust in a way that's never really been seen before. It's why so many people have commented on these commonplaces during lockdown. And you can see there our community heat map, which has been one of the tools that we've deployed in a lot of these conversations. Through this openness, we can create a shared collective understanding of needs, forming a collective view based on all of the data that has been collected from participants, so that because so many people have contributed. And this can help us make more informed decisions and our customers to make more informed decisions. Accelerating collaboration, digital has a role to play in helping to bring people on the journey. Sometimes, not always, people start from a position of resistance, but when listened to and participate, they can become really constructive collaborators. So what does this new normal look like? Waltham Forest, where we worked on their New Holland plans, the scheme itself has been shown by King's College to have an improved air quality such that 42,000 years of additional human life will be created. And if we're talking about collaboration, one of the more pleasing aspects is that the community have collaborated in the engagement and now volunteering to maintain public space. We think this is a moment when things can really change. From what has been a painful disaster, there's an opportunity to create a new way of involving communities and a new way of getting around and a new way of living. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mike. So we're halfway through our presentations now, and we've had a few more people join. Just to reiterate from my earlier comments, if you do have a question, do please post them as we go through to any of our speakers using the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll ask those questions at the end. Our next speaker is Alice Galvin, who's a landscape architect at BDP, and she'll be presenting her idea on Cycle for London. Alice, over to you.
Hello, I'm Alice. I'm from BDP London Urbanism Studio. And to encourage people to cycle, you first need to understand the numbers before lockdown. As Curious previously presented, only 2.5% of the journeys were cycled, with 37% of other journeys in motor private vehicles, with 35% of public transport. During the lockdown, roads have seen 85% reduction in traffic, with the associated nitrogen dioxide levels falling by 35%. However, as Mike also stated, as lockdown is lifted, a surge in private vehicles is likely to occur. Commuters are less likely to use public transport because of health risks. Where the previous graph indicated 35% of journeys carried out by public transport, it's vital that these journeys are switched to either walking or cycling to avoid a massive spike in change to vehicles. The goal is to retain the lockdown priority for cyclists and pedestrians on London roads. Previous cycling campaigns by TfL have focused on a number of different elements to encourage people to cycle. This has ranged from highlighting the health benefits to avoiding the stifling tube temperatures by creating the natural breeze above ground. However, the bigger picture is to try and understand what has stopped people from cycling before. Unfortunately, cycling in London has a bad reputation for being unsafe and dangerous. With an average of 0.7 million daily cyclists in 2018, some London locations had up to 902 collisions in certain locations. First-time cyclists must be assured that their new commute is going to be safe. Currently, London Cycle Network lacks the infrastructure, visibility and cultural integration of other forms of public transport such as the tube. As demonstrated in the picture, cycle lanes are often an afterthought and in some cases, like this road in Camden, put the cyclist at risk. Unlike other European capitals known to be cycle-friendly, cycling is not a natural part of London's cultural integration. A first-time cyclist needs to be reassured that their new journey is easy to navigate, like the Copenhagen example on the screen. Positive cultural integration reinforces a positive experience during the journey. London also lacks currently a visibility for its cycle infrastructure. Although some of the routes are indicated via blue tarmac, for example, this is not the same strategy applied to its bicycle parking for visitors or first-time users to the area. Amsterdam is a great example of how this has worked in the past. Infrastructure, cultural integration and increasing visibility for London cyclists is something that's got to be improved over time. Something that can be addressed immediately is a clear, legible map that indicates existing cycling routes. It should be easy to navigate and plan the routes as the iconic London Tube map. TfL's current cycle map is available, but has not had the level of branding, marketing and refinement as applied to the Tube map. TfL's own cycle map is just an overlay over Google Maps. While there are other alternative cycle maps that follow the Tube orientation, feedback has proven this is difficult to navigate above ground. A comprehensive cycle map needs to be available to download or pick up at future London cycle hubs. Like the current Pocket Map is physically available at every tube station and ready to download on every phone, London also needs a complementary map to assist. Cycle for London looks at providing an iconic, legible guide to introduce new cyclists to routes available across the city. The routes indicated on this map are based on the existing cycle networks and branding, such as cycle superhighways in blue and quiet way routes indicated in purple. The map is arranged geographically to assist with navigation. Locations highlighted are a mix of roads, destinations such as parks, and stations to appeal to both the tourist, the local, and the commuter. The map was inspired by Harry Beck's design language for the tube map as a circuit diagram. The linear tube lines have now become bike chains as a graphic representation of how the journeys can link together, becoming a wider network in the future. Also indicated is the Thames to identify and help with navigation across the city. This map currently only shows existing routes only. Many of you have seen the London Mayor's proposal for pedestrianising multiple major routes, and including the London Streetscape programme wants to accommodate a tenfold increase in cycling numbers. Local councils have already acted during lockdown and started to introduce temporary routes and lanes with the streetscape to facilitate. Although London has done this, its actions are modest in comparison with other cities around the world. Paris, for example, has added 650 kilometres of cycle lanes, Lima has added 300 kilometres, and New York has added 64 kilometres since lockdown. Cycle for London map has the potential to adopt and respond to the new lanes in a similar way to the tube map revisions. As temporary cycle routes established now in strategic locations, which have previously been proven impossible to integrate, now have the power to influence London's future cycle network for the greater good. It is the potential to be developed into a journey planner ability currently available to highlight the route as previously stated, the user needs to be confident that the route they will be taken on will be safe, and if disruption happens mid-journey, they should be able to replan their route for a succinct way. Where the map can be developed for a digital platform, it should also be integrated on the ground in future cycle hubs. Although temporary at first, these future spots have the potential to be integrated into London's cultural acceptance of cycling, just as the Netherlands have done with this underground cycle station. It's easily found by both the tourist and the local. To increase the visibility of existing routes and can encourage users to switch their mode of transport, It is this switch that will help a cultural shift of London to become a city for cyclists, assisted with a map that's easy to read and readily available for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice. Okay, on to our next presentation. So we have Evelyn Wong, who's an urban designer for Tibbles, and she'll be talking about the Creating the Community Superblock idea. Evelyn, over to you.
Great, thanks very much. Hi everyone. So the lockdown environment forced us indoors, but with the relief of being able to go out for daily exercise. At the start, you could feel a very noticeable difference in our neighbourhoods. One, being able to hear or finally notice the birdsong and our lack of urgency to leave the house, and more importantly, much less traffic occupying our streets. You'll notice lots of people walking around, and in my area in Hackney near the canals, it was rare not to come across half a dozen people when out and about. When the sun shone, it was amazing to see people out in droves enjoying their daily exercise, and it was a wonder to see how many people needed to get out of their houses despite the apparent risks of coronavirus. As I walked around the relatively quiet streets of my neighbourhood during lockdown, the movement of cars began to startle me because it felt like they were travelling unnecessarily fast without slowing down for pedestrians. Though it may have felt faster due to the relative new pace of life, it made me wonder, did that car really need to travel down this street? Was it just a convenient shortcut enabled by our extensive road network? It made me think of the Barcelona superblock, where in 2016 they planned to create mini traffic-free neighbourhoods bordered by roads where traffic would continue to flow and the streets within would be repurposed for public life. The proposals were responding to excessive pollution and noise levels, as well as high number of road accidents, sedentary lifestyles, and a lack of green spaces. Results so far in Barcelona have been really positive, with a number of superblocks now implemented. More than half of residents are now walking as their primary mode of transport. Studies estimate if implemented citywide, it would capture up to 70% of street space for bikes and pedestrians and could save 667 lives per year. I recall seeing this Barcelona scheme for the first time and thinking, this is really brilliant. But only in lockdown have I wondered whether or not it could be implemented in London. While I know how much people love their cars with nowhere to go during lockdown, people are inevitably walking and cycling more than ever. And from this picture of people queuing up for Santander cycles, it is clear that the appetite for cycling has increased. So looking at my local neighbourhood on Google Maps, I tested out the principles to ensure that no home was more than 250 metres or 2 to 3 minute walk from the perimeter roads. I set out a general rule that blocks should be no bigger than 500 metres in width and depth, and assigned perimeter routes where they contribute to a semi-regular grid. To close these super blocks down to traffic, I thought it needed to be more than just bollards. Instead, what if a stretch of a street or streets could be transformed into a social open space dedicated to the community? Play Streets jumps to mind immediately. This way, instead of using typical road infrastructure language, traffic would be disrupted by positive human activity. Seeing my local parks swell with people on our sunniest days, while I thought I'd love to see drone images of London city parks, I also thought that this showed a clear appetite for more space to be dedicated to social interaction or simply relaxing outdoors and in the sun. We've all heard about the push for more space for footpaths and cycleways, but areas to sit out should be equally important. Whilst London is fortunate to have a high proportion of green spaces, it seems like we could still use more space for fresh air, relief from living with flatmates, and being cooped up with children. With the restaurants, pubs, and gyms all closed, our open spaces became the only sense of relief, and in Hackney especially, it has been incredible to notice the amount of flats with no access to private open space. It's fair to say that the community superblock follows similar principles as the Low Traffic Neighbourhoods Initiative by Living Streets in London Cycling in terms of limiting traffic to the perimeters, as by doing so it effectively frees up a load of road space for pedestrians and cyclists to move much more freely and safely. And as a well-established concept, we can glean some of the positive results from implemented low traffic neighbourhood schemes. The first low traffic neighbourhood in Waltham Forest saw vehicular travel levels fall by over half inside the residential area and by 16% when including the main roads. This image is of Orford Road in Walthamstow, which used to be a typical traffic-clogged high street. My community superblocks idea is no doubt incredibly simple and draws on various other positive concepts which help to improve our neighbourhoods for communities. The potential health benefits are one of the most important benefits. This graphic map maps out how deaths could be prevented by superblocks in Barcelona, picking up on an increase in physical activity and adding more nature in streets. The nature of the social spaces used to positively disrupt through traffic could vary between superblocks, but should involve seating, planters, and elements of play. The success of parklets being able to create and attract activity within the street is another useful precedent. Of course, getting buy-in from local residents is incredibly important. I've always been in favour of instigating temporary interventions over a period of time, which allow people to get used to an idea and see the benefits without commitment. Play streets and parklets have both used temporary closures and installations to great effect. In fact, I find it incredible that so many people choose their cars over spaces dedicated to play and public life. So many people talk about the good old days when we all used to be able to play in the street without adults being worried. In fact, there are 700 dedicated play streets across England and Wales in the 1950s. These all but disappeared by the 1980s, but thankfully the last 10 to 15 years have seen a resurgence. And as we continue to live through the pandemic, there is an increasing amount of people who have realised their desire and ability to live in less densely populated areas. But by being able to increase the amount of quiet social green space within our immediate vicinity, our neighbourhoods could provide some of those benefits associated with low density, but with the benefits of central urban living. These spaces would help to make London more climate resilient by providing more space to be able to integrate sustainable urban drainage systems, more trees to provide shading and reduce the urban heat island effect, and more places to sit outside and be relieved of our internal spaces that often overheat in the peak of summer if we're lucky enough. The other key benefit for creating the community super block with its integrated social space is the ability to facilitate relationships. Many have reported the joy of getting to know their neighbours over lockdown, which has been fantastic. So by having a space designed for play and gathering, we could ensure that we don't lose sight of these important relationships, which inevitably create safer neighbourhoods. And while I know there would be a million steps to take before being able to roll out such an initiative across London, I do hope that the idea of the community super block plants a few seeds with everyone in their various professions listening in today, as I think this could really enhance our lives considerably. In fact, it would be fantastic for people to explore the model for their own neighbourhoods and for a map of London to be able to be built up, which explores this idea across the city. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Evelyn. Okay, our last speaker today is Gareth Atkinson, Director at Civic Engineers, and he'll be presenting Car Parks to Bike Parks. Gareth, over to you.
Hi everybody, thank you for having us along. There's been some excellent presentations. I suppose I'm picking up also on the bikes scheme system and looking at really what do we do with our bikes at the beginning and the end of all these journeys. I mean, I'm an optimist, I'm a cyclist, and I'm really hopeful that lots of people are going to get on their bike and start cycling into central London. 400 years ago, everyone had a different mode of transport, and they had to park it up where they were going to. And maybe this is what it looked like. It's no doubt a film set, but you can imagine this is where you took your horse and that's where you parked it. And it was pretty simple and it didn't really create too many problems in the streets. However, 400 years later, we've got to this. Just pause and look at that for a minute. That's the Dodgers Stadium in Los Angeles. Built in 1962 for 6,000 parking spaces. That's engineers scaling to demand. I prefer this one, but it still looks a bit unruly. This is Utrecht in Holland. It's the most bike-dominated city in the world. This is a photo, an old photo from outside the mainland station. 1970 decision to design for the bike in Holland has led to a year-on-year increase, although the successful design for it has created its own problem. They've now dealt with that though, and opening up last year, this is the world's biggest covered bicycle facility, completed in August last year, and is now fully operational and has room to park over 12,500 cycles. So I've been part of the cohort working alongside with Kouros on the London Bike Lines idea, thinking about commuting into the city centre. But we need to think about the origins and the destinations. It's great to cycle, but what do we do with our bike at either end? The very act of cycling is actually going to hopefully open up more street space. Removing cars from the road will hopefully allow us to take back more space for wider pavements, for greening, suds, and maybe also for parking those bikes, because we're going to need to put them somewhere, right? This is the case at Origin. Now there's some clever things which come about. So you can hang your bike from your ceiling. You can you've got a really beautiful bike, you can put it up against your wall using all sorts of different mechanisms. But the reality is, if this is the case now, what's he going to get to? We need to think about that. This is an example of what's happening now, and it's great. A load of these have gone in Walthamstow. 10 bikes for every parking space, adding in a bit of greening and suds. Problem is, there's 3,000 people waiting for a space in one of these. This is the sort of parking we've got in central London. It's great, you can park your bike, but really, it's not very good for the street space, is it? Not very good for pedestrians. More importantly, it's not very secure. These two maps show the cycling parking spaces in central London. So you can see on the north there all the parking spots. Unfortunately, the map underneath shows all the cycle thefts. It mimics the one above. So if people want to cycle, they're not only going to need safe cycling infrastructure, but they're also going to need a safe place to park their bikes. Here there's a little bit of a play on letters, but NCP stands for National Car Park. Here's a load of them in central London. Why couldn't they become national cycle parks? I think a lot of you recognise this building. Fortunately, there's not an opportunity to transfer this into a cycle park now, and it's understandable because where these buildings are located, they're in places where they're worth a lot of money, and repurposing or refurbishing this or demolishing it and turning it into something new is going to be more favourable. But we've got a responsibility to build back better. We've got a responsibility to repurpose. How about this? We've got the opportunity to build back reused buildings. We could create cycle parks at lower floors, put retail in, add cycle enterprises, convert partially to office, put resi in, increase the height of buildings. All these things we're very capable to do as engineers, architects, and professions within our industry. Secure cycle parks are happening across London. Here's a picture. Predominantly, they go into basements, which is fine. Less valuable. I like this. I just had to put it in. I found this picture on the internet. If I was being encouraged to work at a new company, a new office in London, they had that in their basement, that would definitely be a thumbs up for me. As long as they had some decent showers as well. But those sort of things might encourage people in the future to join your company. So important things. We need to be thinking about good-looking spaces as well as functional ones. This is this got actually shoehorned into a project which I worked on near Cannon Street, and it's great. They just suck in a small independent shop called Spanner, look after your bikes, and they can look after your dry cleaning. So, but where else can we look? We can look further abroad. In Japan, they've come up with some great ideas. Mechanically stored automated cycle stores on the left, and on the right, one showing going below ground in London. Could we repurpose places in London? This is Aldwych, the closed tube station. How many other spaces have we got underground? Could we have automated systems? Could we take bikes down there? All these things we've got to be, blue sky thinking. We've got to keep up, look at. Let's use the spaces we've got. So this is the future, or I hope it is. Healthy people, green streets, active travel, less pollution, suds, and hopefully somewhere safe to park your bike.
Great, thank you very much, Gareth, and to all of our speakers. So we're going to move on to a Q&A. We've got about 15 minutes now. If you do have any questions for any of the speakers about their presentations, or in general, anything about active travel you'd like to ask, please do post on the Q&A. We've got quite a lot of questions coming through, so I'm just going to dive straight in. This is a really good one and kind of an overarching one that covers everyone. And the question is, in your opinion, I think this is kind of open to all, but in your opinion, does the patchwork of London boroughs impede change? Could more be achieved under a unified London authority? I think that, a few of those ideas, obviously the bike lines, your super blocks idea, Evelyn, would be impacted by those changes from borough to borough. who would like to take that one? Kuros?
Yeah, the feedback that we've had is that different London boroughs, you know, some are more cycle friendly, cycling infrastructure and improvements are easier to implement, whilst others are, you know, less excited by the ideas and have a different sort of populace to satisfy. So it would certainly be easier if there was a citywide sort of think tank and sort of control over, you know, our streets, basically, which currently, you know, the maintenance, etc., and management of them resides with, you know, the boroughs, albeit that the planning and the you know, the infrastructure improvements, quite a lot of them are made by TfL. So in answer to the question, yes, it would, and that is a very it's a very big question for London, and I'm sure, you know, it has been debated in great detail.
It's one we actually get asked on model talks all the time at the building centre and the city centre, particularly from international visitors who are just astonished that we've got sort of 32 boroughs out there all kind of doing different things, and where's our London master plan? And I know Peter Murray and I and many people at NLA are constantly talking about this. It kind of leads into, Mike, I'm going to come to you, and just your thoughts on that, which links into another question that's on here, which is just around how many boroughs you're working with, and the kind of difficulty around the sort of different ways of doing things across London.
Sure, thanks. I mean, I would actually put forward a slightly different view, which is I think that the boroughs do something is to engage people in local conversations, and I think people sometimes respond more easily and more readily when the conversation is set very locally. So I think there is something that works really well from the conversation starting from a local basis up. But of course, some of the initiatives that have been talked about today, which are joining up those routes across London, are fantastic as well. We're working with 8 London boroughs on the kind of recovery responses at the moment, but about 12 or 13 in total. And I think somebody also asked how long the data was going to be available for, I think. So one of the things that we commit to actually is that even when the engagement itself has been closed, i.e. nobody can add more comments, we will host the engagement in perpetuity on our website. So you can always go in and see all of the historic engagements and everything that everybody said, and we will continue hosting that for you know, forever.
Great. Evelyn, I'm going to come to you. There's a question here around the sort of Barcelona case study you had. And the question is whether you know how that project was funded. Did Barcelona fund that project? And have you had any thoughts about how we might fund the Superblocks idea in London?
I was actually just doing a quick Google to see how that has been funded. I believe there was an initial budget from the city to help start it going. But I mean, in terms of London, I mean, I know that there's a huge budget to help battle and combat air pollution on our streets. I believe the last time I heard about it, I think there'd only been a small portion spent, because a lot of the money was going to fund like electric vehicles, electric charging and things like that. Whereas I think that budget could be used to fund a more holistic approach, such as something like the community superblocks, which would affect the air quality in our neighbourhoods quite positively.
Great, thank you. So the next question we have is, again, more of a general question. I think it's focused on cycling again. What do you all hope to see in London in terms of cycling in a best case scenario, and what part does road pricing play? Alice, why don't I come to you? Obviously, you want to see a map, but maybe you can comment on overall what you might like to see in terms of those provisions for cycling.
I think the way that the councils have responded so quickly by creating these temporary routes, I hope that the public have seen the benefits of not having cars on the roads, and that now there's a better case for the Mayor of London to push some of those roads to be pedestrianised, and there's not going to be such a big backlash when they propose to do them. something that was quite disappointing was when the Oxford Street proposals were originally proposed to be pedestrianised, and then quite a lot of pressure turned them not to be pedestrianised. So it'd be interesting to see if that now has changed people's perspective on the benefits of cycling.
I think maybe Peter can do another drawing on Oxford Street this time. He's done a few. So Ben, I'm going to come to you just kind of on a similar point. Kind of what would you like to see in terms of cycling in a best case scenario? And then actually, while I've got you, there's also another question here, which is just a quick query for London Bike Lines. This person lives in Southwark, in Walworth. And we have several of these cycle superhighways and quiet ways. So in some ways, is there a demand for a new line? And also, are already existing routes, in this case around Camberwell and Elephant Castle, does that impact the idea of the London Bike Lines?
Is that question to me, Benjamin?
That's to you, yes. Sorry, it's
yeah.
Ben. There
is a great network. There is a great network of cycle lanes and quiet ways. It's effectively a very, quiet way is a very quick way of establishing routes that were safe for people to use. But as the mapping, as I think one of Alice's slides showed, it's not, the network is not that legible, and it doesn't really, it serves to transport people locally, to make local connections. But what we're talking about are really, really direct, fast routes for cyclists to take into the centre of London, not in terms of cycling fast, but unimpeded by buses pulling in and other sort of interruptions. They sit very much beside the existing cycle superhighway structure and the quiet way structure, but they are just a much more a bigger sort of scheme that really connects people within Zone 4 directly with the centre. And I know that not all jobs are in the centre of London. We've had comments like that, but by connecting people within a half-hour zone, most people, when surveyed, I think sort of 31 minutes, between 29 and 31 minutes was the sort of mean travel time that people would tolerate to get to work by bike. And that's going at sort of 2.5 to 3 times the speed of walking. So we're not talking about high-speed trips. This is a network that would support the existing network. We wouldn't dismantle anything, but it's something that we could perhaps implement fairly quickly. We could test to see if it works. We wouldn't have to do them all at the same time, but we have the opportunity now and a little bit of momentum to do something on a bit of a grander scale. And the cycle superhighways are usually fixed elements, and they can be a bit slow to implement. They have to be tested, and I think, as somebody said, it takes about 6 months to agree changing of a single pedestrian crossing in terms of timing. And that was one of our team was saying that to do something on this scale is almost too complicated to calculate, and therefore would need to have just to be implemented and tested.
Sure. Apologies, Benjamin, I'm going to come to you now. So yes, just on the provisions for cyclists, what would you like to see? And also, what are kind of some of the barriers to implementing your cycle taxis? What are the sort of challenges that you're seeing there?
So in terms of what I'd like to see in London, a lot more car-free streets. I think for the scale of cycling that we could be reaching, I think cycle tracks are great up to a certain scale, but then it becomes a lot simpler to disentangle the through routes such that you have filtered throughways for cycles that exclude motor vehicles from driving all the way along, but they can still access places all the way along. And this is something that you see in the development of cycling cities all over the world. In Amsterdam, Copenhagen, they tend to start off putting in cycle tracks, and then they move on to the next stage, which is just filtering certain throughways and disentangling the networks entirely. And I think that's, for me, I think that, you know, the ceiling on the level of cycling in London is really, really high, because it's such a big city where there are so many journeys that make complete sense for cycling. And, you know, I guess maybe the levels of cycling that we see, like in the centre of Amsterdam, like 2/3 of all trips, that might be difficult to achieve. But I think certainly something like 35-40% of all trips in London could be achievable. And when you look at that, the current level of cycling in London at about 2.5% of all trips, I mean, we've got a long way to go. And I think that we could be moving really fast right now. And I hope that TfL and the boroughs do start to move a bit quicker, because there's clear demand for a lot more cycling around to get around London.
Definitely, thank you.
In terms of barriers to our service, at the minute what we're seeing is that there are a lot of people out of work who have access to motor vehicles and are therefore prepared to work very cheaply. And also the level of congestion has just about risen up to the level that it was before. We're expecting the level of congestion to keep on rising. But the issue we've got is that when you have people that are prepared to work for essentially illegally low wages, and you have employees that you are paying a legal wage to, that the people that are prepared to work for illegally low wages can undercut you. So they're working as contractors, and many people are on furlough and maybe picking up a few hours here and there. And that's what we're seeing as one of the main barriers at the minute, but we're not expecting that to be long lasting. And we have car prices to try and mitigate that issue.
Thank you. So this question's coming over to you, Gareth. How can London deliver/fund cycle parking infrastructure in incredibly high value central London areas? You touched on it. Is this about planning obligations, developer contributions, or delivering this within limited public realm?
Well, it could. I think it could be all of those. But also, there's. I think as a structural engineering hat on, which I often have on, is how can you educate developers and clients of their buildings, of what their capability are, rather than knocking things down and starting again. You know, we've got a responsibility to build back sustainably. There's many opportunities now where we're enhancing existing buildings. So if you have a car park structure or an office building, why can't you give over the basement or the lower 2 floors to cycle parking, but add some stories on top? So planning, yes, they need to allow people to change their buildings, and that needs to coincide with being sustainable, using sustainable materials and reusing existing buildings to make sure that we're not using up all our carbon credits.
Okay, I think we've probably got time for one more quick one. This is one that's come up a few times today. How do you think we solve the increase in cars? And Ben, you touched on it, along with the increase in cycling. Should we ban cars and vans? Why don't I come to Alice? Do you want to take that one?
Sure. I saw an idea where they were looking at mitigating the increase of cars by temporarily increasing the congestion charge rate, just as to offset the increase. And what was the second part of the question? Sorry.
The second part of the question, which is, hang on a second, let me just go on to it. How do you think we solve the increase in cars along with the increase in cycling? Should we ban cars and vans?
I think it's obviously London's aim to ban cars eventually, whether these like automated vehicles, so rather than driven, they're just like car share that reduce the number of individual cars and the car share ride takes over. That would be ideal, and then you'd have less pollution on the roads as well. And there's also a case for a number of buildings, unfortunately, are going to be unused for a temporary while. So could those become housing for the bike solution as well? So I think, yes, in the long run, London should look to lower its cars on the roads.
Great, thank you. I'm going to wrap up. We have got a lot of questions that were unanswered, so apologies if we didn't get to your question. I think it's pretty clear it's an amazing opportunity now for us to kind of capitalise on the recovery period to really get our streets working better. There's lots of plans around pedestrianisation. It seems like every day there's a new plan for pedestrianising a street. So I'm really looking forward to see how that goes forward and what happens. We did have a number of ideas submitted for this event, and over the coming weeks we'll be sharing some of those across our other platforms, so do stay tuned for more of our Build Back Better series, and we will be hosting a few more of these PechaKuchas going over the next 6 weeks. If you want to get involved, please do get in touch with myself or someone at NLA, and I think it's info@newlondonarchitecture.org, and stay tuned for future events. We've got a few things coming up next week, but a very busy programme over the next couple of months. And thank you for coming today, and thank you to all of our speakers.